cold on the Montana border never knocks. It creeps through the smallest cracks in the cedar planks, carrying the scent of frost in the middle of nowhere. The clock on the forge wall read 2014 a.m. Gideon Vane lifted the glowing red steel from the furnace, tiny sparks scattering like shooting stars burning out in the dark. The hammer struck the anvil in a dry, authoritative rhythm. With every strike, Gideon poured all his focus into the metal. He wasn't just forging a blade or a gun part. He was trying to drown out the dead silence of the Blackfoot Mountains. At 32, Gideon had the rough, scarred hands of a laborer and the long, sensitive fingers of a master watchmaker. The Vane family had been casting guns for the U.S. government since the Civil War, but Gideon was the last man standing, choosing to hide away in an old forge restoring antiques instead of churning out modern killing machines. The heavy scent of coal blended with the sweet metallic tang of gun oil. Gideon plunged the steel into the quenching tank. A violent hiss erupted, and a pillar of white smoke shot toward the high ceiling. As the sound died down, he caught an unfamiliar noise. It wasn't a wolf, nor was it a snowslide off Peak's summit. It was the sound of metal hitting stone, about 50 yards from the shop door. An uneven footfall. Gideon didn't rush. He reached for the Colt 911 on the wooden rack, racking the slide so quietly the click of the bolt barely disturbed the dust in the air. He stepped into the shadow of the large furnace, eyes locked on the heavy timber door. The door creaked open. Snow swirled in on the wind, making the furnace flames flicker. A figure collapsed across the threshold. It was a woman. She wore a worn-out field coat, covered in snow and a dark liquid that was freezing solid in the sub-zero temperatures. She wasn't empty-handed. She clutched a long, cowhide-wrapped bundle to her chest like it was a child. Gideon lowered his gun, but kept his finger near the bang switch. He stepped forward, the heat from the forge still radiating off his skin, a stark contrast to the deathly chill coming off the stranger. "Shop's been closed since 10, Gideon said, his voice raspy from disuse. The woman looked up. Her face was a map of wrinkles carved by time and hard living, her ash-colored eyes clouded but sharp. She was Cassidy Rhodes. She didn't say a word. She just used her last bit of strength to shove the leather bundle toward Gideon before passing out. Gideon caught her and laid her on the leather mat next to his workbench. The wound in her side was still oozing a bullet graze, not deep, but losing that much blood in this cold was a death sentence. He moved fast, using gauze and high-proof alcohol for first aid. Throughout it all, Cassidy remained unconscious, but her thin hand still clawed at his shirt like a final prayer. Once he was sure her pulse was steady, Gideon turned to the leather bundle. He set it on the workbench under the dim yellow light of an oil lamp. As he undid the twine, the leather fell away, revealing an M24 sniper rifle. Gideon froze. He had restored thousands of firearms, but this wasn't some common collector's item. This M24 was caked in a layer of petrified mud, as if it had just been dug up from a 6-foot deep hole. Rust had eaten deep into the barrel, and the old camo paint had completely peeled away. He picked up a magnifying glass and inspected the receiver. A chill ran down his spine when he saw the serial number crudely, hand engraved under the bolt. SBW01 meant. "No way in hell," Gideon muttered. He grabbed a specialized toolkit. His hands moved like a pre-programmed machine. Safety off, bolt out, trigger assembly removed. When he pulled the rubber butt pad off the stock, a small black object fell out. It wasn't a gun part. It was an early generation memory chip, encased in hard, waterproof resin. Right then Cassidy jolted awake. She sat up, gasping for air like she'd just surfaced from a nightmare. Don't boot that up here," she rasped, her eyes in a chip in Gideon's hand. "He'll know. Sterling Vance will know." Gideon looked at her, his brow furrowed. "Who are you? Why do you have this?" "This serial number. My grandfather used to talk about it. Project Manticore. He said it was a stain the Vane family would take to their graves." Cassidy struggled to sit up, leaning against the table leg. "Your grandfather was a good man, Gideon. He was the only one in Ghost Junction back then who tried to do something. But the bullets he cast, they didn't just kill people. They wiped out a whole reality." She pointed a shaking finger at the stripped rifle on the table. "That chip holds the names of the people of Ghost Junction. The ones who died from chemical toxins in a test Sterling Vance called a technical glitch. He's running for president, Gideon. He's scrubbing every last scrap of the past. And I'm the biggest scrap left. Insta. Gideon felt the room closing in. Project Manticore wasn't just some urban legend in the gunsmithing world. It was real. And his family, those dedicated Smiths, had played a hand in a massacre of civilians on American soil. Before Gideon could ask more, a powerful beam of light suddenly swept across the forge windows. The roar of heavy SUVs tore through the mountain silence. "They're here," Cassidy hissed, her hand fumbling for a sidearm she was too weak to use. Gideon blew out the oil lamp instantly. The forge plunged into darkness, save for the faint orange glow from the coals. He shoved the chip into his pocket and dragged Cassidy toward the coal bunker behind the furnace. "Stay put," he ordered. Outside, car doors slammed in rapid succession. Boots crunched on the dry snow, sharp and threatening. Gideon counted silently, at least 6 of them. They moved in a professional formation, fanning out to cover the exits. A distorted voice boomed through a megaphone. "Gideon Vane, we know you're holding government property. Hand over the woman and the item and you walk away clean. Don't let the Vane legacy end tonight." Gideon stood in the dark, Colt 911 in one hand, a 20-pound sledgehammer in the other. He knew this shop better than anyone. He knew which floorboards creaked to create a distraction. He knew which angles would catch the light from outside and blind an intruder. The front door was kicked in. 3 operators in black armor carrying HK-4 Singstons with infrared optics stepped inside. They moved cautiously, muzzles sweeping every corner. "Room clear," one reported over the comms. Right then, Gideon hurled a handful of coal dust into the glowing furnace. A massive whoosh filled the room as a fireball erupted, sending a thick cloud of ash and soot into the air, blinding their thermal vision. Gideon made his move. He didn't fire immediately. A muzzle flash would give him away. He closed the gap on the nearest man from behind the quenching tank. The sledgehammer came down on the man's shoulder, dropping him before he could even let out a grunt. Before the other 2 could pivot, Gideon rolled under the workbench and opened fire. Bang! Bang! 2 precise shots into the gaps between helmets and vests. 2 bodies hit the floor. "Damn it, we've got a situation," a shout came from outside. The remaining 3 opened up, spraying the forge with lead. Wood splinters flew. The oil tank was punctured, and as the oil spilled across the floor and hit the furnace, it ignited. Gideon crawled back toward the coal bunker and hauled Cassidy up. "We have to take the drainage tunnel." "Move." Cassidy gritted her teeth against the pane, clinging to Gideon's shoulder. They pushed through the thick smoke, and the growing flames licking at his priceless antique racks. Gideon looked back at the forge one last time. His father and grandfather's life work was going up in smoke. A sharp pain tightened in his chest, but he knew if they didn't leave now, the secret of Ghost Junction would be burned to a crisp forever. They dropped into the narrow tunnel, just as a massive explosion from the gas tanks rocked the ground. Gideon pushed Cassidy ahead through the underground darkness, while the thrum of a helicopter began to pulse overhead. The freezing wastewater soaked through his boots, but Gideon didn't miss a beat. He hauled Cassidy onto his shoulder, his boots churning through the slick muck of the narrow sewer until they breached a natural drainage spillway, hidden behind a stand of old-growth pines. Behind them, the sky glowed a lethal shade of orange. The Vane Forge, a repository of 3 generations of history, was now nothing more than a giant torch in the middle of the snow. The scream of helicopter rotors ripped through the air overhead, spotlights scanning the mountainside like demon eyes hunting for prey. Gideon shoved his 1986 Ford F-150 out from under a lean-to camouflaged with brush. He eased Cassidy into the passenger seat. Her hand was ice cold, yet it still trembled as she touched the stock of the stripped-down M24 Gideon had managed to shove into his gear bag. "We can't stay on the main roads for long," Cassidy wheezed, her breath forming white plumes in the dark cabin. "Vance has eyes and ears at every state checkpoint." Gideon didn't answer. He slammed it into gear. The engine roared and the truck bolted into the blackness of a backwoods trail heading south. He cut the headlights, relying only on old military night vision goggles to navigate the hairpin turns along the cliffside. After 3 hours of moving in silence, As a dim dawn began to break over the limestone ridges of Wyoming, Gideon finally dared to ease off the gas. Cassidy had drifted off at some point, her face looking hauntingly old and exhausted in the morning light. Gideon glanced at the gear bag where the memory chip and the rusted rifle lay. He thought back to his grandfather, Silas Vane, a man whose hands had stayed strangely clean despite working in a foundry. Now he understood that cleanliness was a desperate attempt to wash away what he'd done. Cassidy stirred, opening her eyes to the bone-dry desert stretching out before them. "Why'd you pick me?" Gideon broke the silence. "You could have gone to the papers or the FBI." Cassidy let out a faint, bitter laugh. "I tried, Gideon. 10 years ago, I sent files to a reporter in Denver. 3 days later, he was dead in a drunk driving accident. 5 years ago, I was supposed to meet a federal agent, but before the sit-down, his house leveled in a gas leak. Sterling Vance isn't just a politician. He's a ghost haunting the machine. Only the Vanes understand the weapon he's using. Only you know how to crack the safe without setting off the charge." She tilted her head, looking deep into his eyes. "Do you know what Ghost Junction really was? It wasn't a lab accident. It was a field test. Vance wanted to know if the Manticore chemical rounds your grandfather built could wipe out a population without damaging the infrastructure. He called it humane warfare. No bombs, no rubble, just clean corpses." Gideon felt his chest tighten. "My grandfather, he told me he made guns to protect freedom. He was trying to protect what was left of his soul," Cassidy continued, her voice dropping into a grim, fairy tale tone. "The night of the massacre, when the order came down from Vance's command, our Black Cell unit fired on the town from the hillsides. But something went wrong. The rounds didn't disperse the toxins on schedule. The casings cracked early, or the powder was damp. It created a 15-minute window before the gas reached lethal levels." She paused, her shaking fingers brushing the M24's stock. "That 15 minutes gave me enough time to realize what I was doing. I saw a young woman holding a child, running out of a grocery store. I went to pull the trigger, but your grandfather's bullet, it jammed right in the chamber. That wasn't some random glitch, Gideon. Silas Vane intentionally boxed the specs on that shipment. He knew Vance would use them, so he baked in a silent saving grace." Gideon slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt in the middle of a desolate Nevada stretch. He pulled out the M24 and used a screwdriver to pull the butt plate again. This time he wasn't looking for a chip. He shone a light deep into the steel frame of the stock. There, engraved with a microscopic needle, was a line only a Vane gunsmith would recognize. "Regret is the final round. 14 souls alive. Find Ghost Junction." 14 people, Gideon muttered. "He saved 14 people with those defective rounds, including me and my family," Cassidy said, tears carving paths through the dust on her face. "I turned my gun on my commanding officer when he tried to use a flamethrower on the survivors. I survived because of your grandfather's betrayal of Vance. But that betrayal came with a heavy price. Silas had to stay quiet to protect your father, to protect you. He lived in hell so you could grow up in the light." Gideon gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. The truth about his grandfather was no longer a haunting shadow. It was a call to arms. He looked toward the horizon, where the Nevada heat was beginning to make the air shimmer. "Vance doesn't know about the chip. He knows evidence exists, but he thinks it went down with the records plane in '90. He didn't expect me to hide it inside the very gun that killed his officer, then bury it deep in the sand of Ghost Junction for nearly 40 years. I only dug it up a week ago." "He won't stop at Montana," Gideon said, his eyes scanning the rearview mirror. A small black speck appeared on the horizon behind them. It wasn't a civilian car. It was moving too fast, too steady. "They're using drones to track the heat signature of this old engine," Gideon assessed. He yanked the wheel, diving the Ford onto a red dirt trail leading into a limestone canyon. "We need to shake it before it calls in backup from the nearby airbase." He drove like a madman over jagged rocks, red dust billowing up to mask their trail. Gideon spotted an abandoned gas station, its tin roof half collapsed, tucked behind a massive rock face. "Get out now," he yelled. They barely scrambled inside before the whistle of a small heat-seeking missile cut through the air. The Ford F-150 disintegrated in a massive fireball, shrapnel peppering the rock walls. The shockwave threw Gideon and Cassidy deep into a pit of old tires. In the flickering light of the wreckage outside, Gideon saw Cassidy clutching her side. Blood was soaking through the bandages again. She was pale, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Gideon, listen," she said, her voice weak but steady. "I can't go any further. The wound, and I'm no spring chicken. You have to go. Ghost Junction is only about 60 miles southwest from here. There's a secret entrance through the old post office basement. I'm not leaving you," Gideon gritted out. He began scavenging electronic components from an old radio and a battery charger left in the shop. "The veins made the bullets that killed your people. I'm not here to repeat history." His hands moved with lightning speed, splicing copper wires and shorting out circuit boards. "You said advanced trust technology? I'm going to show 'em what old school know-how can do." Above them, the drone's hum was still hunting. Gideon finished his crude jammer and electromagnetic trap that could spoof thermal radar for a few minutes. He rigged it to an old cart and sent it rolling down a rocky gully in the opposite direction. As a drone banked to follow the decoy, Gideon helped Cassidy up. They had no truck and no Montana darkness to hide in. Before them lay the sun-scorched Nevada desert, where Sterling Vance was mobilizing a small army to bury the final secret. Gideon looked at the M24 now tucked securely in his pack. Gideon hoisted Cassidy up, her arm draping over his neck, feeling light as a feather, her skin burning as the fever began to redline. Behind them, the abandoned gas station was nothing more than a thin pillar of black smoke being torn apart by the desert wind. Gideon's electromagnetic trap had bought them another 3 miles of breathing room to the northeast, but he knew it was just a stay of execution. They pushed into the Badlands, a place where eroded limestone cliffs formed natural mazes with no way out. Every step Gideon took sank deep into red dust as fine as talcum powder. Cassidy's breathing was a pain wheeze in his ear. Every beat of her heart felt like a countdown for the world's last witness. "Rest a minute, Gideon," Cassidy rasped when they found a narrow rock crevice where a sliver of shade offered a measly bit of cover. Gideon set her down on the cool sand. He took their last canteen, only daring to dampen her cracked lips. The wound in Cassidy's side had turned a deep purple, a bad moon rising sign of infection. "You gotta hang tough," Gideon said, his voice as hard as cold-rolled steel. "We've clocked 10 miles already." Cassidy looked at him, her clouded ash eyes suddenly sparking with a strange light. 10 miles, or 10 lifetimes, it's all the same. Sterling Vance, he won't let us make it. He's calling in the Desert Guard. Those are the hired guns paid to make people disappear along with his secrets. She grabbed Gideon's hand, her grip weak but desperate. "If I don't pull through, you take that chip. Don't look back for me. Ghost Junction doesn't need another old corpse. It needs the truth." "My family owes you a life, Cassidy," Gideon said, looking her dead in the eye, every word weighing a ton. "My grandfather baked salvation into those rounds so you'd live. I'm not about to repeat the Vane family's mistakes by cutting you loose. I'm paying his debt with my own life if that's what it takes." The desert silence was suddenly shattered by a low-frequency hum. Not a chopper, but the throaty growl of high-displacement engines. Gideon pressed his ear to the red earth. The vibration signaled at least 4 off-road rigs flanking them from the northern ridge. "We're done running on foot," Gideon assessed. He scanned the crevice. 50 yards out, an old Jeep Wrangler left behind by some prospector decades ago sat skeletal, its tires rotted away, but the chassis still intact. Gideon dragged Cassidy toward the rig. The logic of a master gunsmith began firing in his brain. A car that won't start isn't necessarily useless. Gideon pulled the bolt from the M24, using it as a steel pry bar to pop the rusted hood. He needed a silver bullet. In the Jeep's glove box, he found a few boxes of dud ammo and a bottle of heavy-duty degreaser. "Cassidy, can you run a sidearm lefty?" She nodded, drawing the pistol from her belt with stone-cold resolve. The Desert Guard crested the ridge. Dirt bikes went airborne over the rock ledges, kicking up massive dust clouds. They were packing high-end autos in long-range glass. The lead rider signaled, the formation fanning out into a horseshoe, pinning the lone Jeep in the middle of the stone basin. "Hand over the chip, Vane," The senator promises to give you a quicker end than your grandfather got. The megaphone boomed across the canyon. Gideon didn't say a word. He was busy with his handcrafted masterpiece. He took the powder from the dud rounds, mixed it with the degreaser and motor oil, creating a high-yield incendiary cocktail inside the Jeep's old battery casing. He rigged a lead from the sniper rifle's firing assembly to this DIY explosive. Now, Gideon yelled. He kicked the jam gear shift hard, sending the Jeep sliding down the rocky slope on momentum. The operators immediately opened up, shredding the oncoming vehicle with lead. When the Jeep slammed into a massive boulder right in the center of their formation, Gideon yanked the long wire to trip the remote detonator. A deafening crack echoed out. It wasn't a big high-explosive blast, but a blinding white chemical fireball that sent jagged rusted steel flying like grape shot. The sudden heat bloom fried the enemy's thermal optics, creating a thick fog of fire. In that heartbeat of chaos, Gideon threw Cassie over his shoulder and bolted from the crevice, heading for the bikes the riders had ditched while trying to escape the wall of fire. He jumped onto a bike that was still idling, sat Cassidy in front of him, and pinned her against the bars. "Hang on tight," the bike screamed, tearing across the rugged red earth. Gideon rode with a suicidal streak, jumping desert fissures without even looking for a trail. Behind them, gunfire popped sporadically before being swallowed by the wind. As the sun began to dip, staining the Nevada sky the color of blood, they pulled over at a small limestone cave to dodge the bone-chilling desert night. Cassidy had slipped deeper into a coma. Her breath was so thin Gideon had to press his ear to her chest to hear it. He heated a small knife in the fire, gritting his teeth as he lanced the wound to drain the infection, cleaning it with their final drops of water. She opened her eyes slightly, seeing Gideon sitting by a carefully shielded fire. Across his lap, the M24 was fully reassembled, the rusted parts hand-polished with fine sand and oil along the way. "Gideon," she whispered, "do you see them? The stars, they look like the souls at Ghost Junction that night. They can't sleep, because the truth is still buried." Gideon looked up at the vast night sky. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel like a lonely gunsmith in Montana. He felt like a part of a trajectory of justice that had been bent for 38 years. And now, he was the man bending it back. "They're about to get some peace, Cassidy," Gideon said, his hand tightening on the grip. "Tomorrow we walk into Ghost Junction, and Sterling Vance is going to find out that no amount of power can scrub a crime clean when the survivors are still breathing." The dawn of the fourth day brought no warmth. It was a bruised purple streak cutting across the horizon, casting jagged shadows over the desert rock. Gideon twisted the throttle gently, his bike clearing a narrow mountain pass before jerking to a sudden halt. There, emerging from a thick shroud of salt mist, lay Ghost Junction. The town didn't sit on the horizon. It looked as if it had been swallowed by a massive basin, ringed by rusted concertina wire and military restricted area signs, so weathered by the sand they were unreadable. Ghost Junction was a gray concrete graveyard. The main street storefronts, with their shattered glass, looked like the hollowed-out sockets of giant skulls. There were no birds, no insects, only the wind whistling through the cracks of crumbling brick walls, playing a permanent funeral dirge. Cassidy stirred against Gideon's back. The fever had bled her white, but at the sight of the half-collapsed iron welcome arch, she managed a shaky whisper, We're home." Gideon stashed the bike in an old fuel shed on the edge of town, throwing a sand-colored tarp over it. He did a final check on the M24. Full mag, optics zeroed. He shouldered Cassidy's weight as they hiked toward the town center. Every footfall on the peeling asphalt echoed unnaturally, as if 1,000 ghosts were marching right alongside them. "Post office is at the end of Main," Cassidy rasped, pointing toward a red brick building that was the only thing still standing relatively intact. "The vault, it's under the sorting room. That's where the hard copies are. The stuff Vance can't wipe with a keystroke." They crossed the central square. Gideon paused by a small park where the skeletons of a swing set still swayed in the breeze. Under his boot, half buried in the sand, sat a faded red child's shoe. A cold shiver raced down his spine. This wasn't a battlefield. It was a slaughterhouse floor, where the victims never even knew why they had to die. The post office loomed ahead, its heavy iron doors secured by a massive mechanical lock from the 80s. Gideon knelt before it, pressing his ear to the cold metal. He didn't use explosives. A blast would be a dinner bell for Vance's crew. He pulled a set of picks from his gunsmithing kit. In Gideon's mind, the lock's internals mapped out like a complex bolt assembly. He listened for the soft click of each steel tumbler finding its home. The logic of a smith told him that metal has its own memory, and after 38 years, this lock was fighting to keep its secrets buried. Hurry, Gideon. I hear engines, Cassidy warned, leaning against a stone pillar, her eyes glued to the horizon behind them. Sweat poured down Gideon's face despite the morning chill. The fourth tumbler finally gave. The iron door groaned open, revealing a pitch-black maw smelling of rotted paper, the musty stench of captive time. They descended into the vault. Under his flashlight's beam, towering file racks appeared. The dust so thick, their footprints left deep craters. Gideon hunted for the section labeled 1988 Special Classification. He found an olive-drab steel box bearing a Department of Defense seal. Inside were thousands of pages, black and white photos of the massacre site, marked with cold clinical codes. But the Holy Grail sat at the bottom, a small reel-to-reel recorder and the original manifest hand-signed by Sterling Vance, authorizing the use of Manticore on civilian targets to optimize field data. Gotcha, Gideon said, his fingers tightening on the paper. The senator's death warrant. Right then, a deafening blast rocked the ceiling above them. The vault shook, dust raining down like ash. Vane, quit hiding in a hole like a rat. Sterling Vance's voice echoed down, not through a megaphone, but his actual voice from the vault entrance. He made better time than Gideon figured. Gideon shoved the files into his pack and handed Cassidy the recorder. He deployed the M24, setting the bipod on an old desk. Lights spilled down the vault stairs in a long shaft, and Sterling Vance stepped into it. He wasn't in a DC power suit anymore. He wore dark field gear, a nickel-plated sidearm in his hand, his old face etched with power and unrepentant cruelty. 4 heavily armed operators hovered behind him, but Vance signaled them to hold. He wanted to face the last stain himself. The Vanes were always top-tier craftsmen, Gideon, Vance said, his voice booming in the cramped vault. But your kind always lacked one thing, the big picture. Your grandfather thought saving 14 lives was some grand feat. He didn't get that those 14 souls were just a rounding error in a calculation to secure a nation's strength. My grandfather died with regret. You're gonna die with the truth, Gideon countered, eyes locked into the glass, though he didn't squeeze yet. He needed Vance to walk into the trap. Vance laughed, a sound as dry as leaves on a grave. The truth? In Ghost Junction, the only truth is white sand and old bones. You think you're sending that out? I'd blacked out every satellite signal for 50 miles. You're in a box, Gideon, and I'm the one holding the lid. He took a step forward, his leather boots thudding with authority on the concrete. Give me that bag. I'll see to it that you and the woman get a proper burial next to your grandfather in Montana. It's the final mercy of a future president. Gideon glanced at Cassidy. She was shaking, but her eyes held a burning hatred for Vance that could scorch the desert. She gave Gideon a slight nod, the signal. Gideon didn't fire the M24. Instead, he hurled a black spear toward the towering file racks behind Vance. It was a DIY charge made of coal dust and solvent he'd prepped earlier. Boom! The blast didn't kill anyone, but it brought the massive racks crashing down, creating a whiteout blizzard of paper and choking dust that filled the vault. In the chaos, Gideon slung Cassidy over his shoulder and bolted for a small service hatch she'd pointed out earlier, a ventilation shaft leading straight to the town square. After them, kill 'em both, Vance roared through the gloom. Gideon shoved Cassidy into the pipe and scrambled in after. They broke out into the square just as the sun hit its zenith. The heat hit them like a slap in the face. Gideon knew the running was over. It was time for a square go amidst the ruins. He tucked Cassidy into a sniper's nest behind the stone wall of a ruined church with a clear view of the square. Gideon, this is where they died, Cassidy whispered, her hand clutching a piece of rotted wood from the altar. Don't let 'em walk out of here a winner. Gideon chambered the first round. He didn't use the standard stuff. He pulled out a single round with a noticeably darker brass casing, a bullet hand-cast. From his grandfather's final batch of steel, the steel Silas Vane swore would find the hearts of traitors. The heat shimmer rising from the concrete of the Ghost Junction square warped the figures of the operatives fanning out in a pincer movement. Sterling Vance stepped out last, his nickel-plated sidearm glinting under the desert sun like a cocky middle finger to the world. He wasn't rushing. He knew Gideon was dug in somewhere among the ruins of the old church, and he banked on his power being enough to crush this final stand. Gideon lay flat against the thick dust of the half-collapsed bell tower. The M24 was perched on a stone ledge, its dark muzzle pointed toward the square. Beside him, Cassidy leaned against the rubble, her trembling hands clutching the recorder. Her breath came in ragged hitches, but her eyes remained sharp, tracking every move of the hired help below. Gideon, winds coming out of the west, Cassidy rasped, the old bounty hunter instincts kicking in. Maybe 4 miles an hour. Zero humidity. Don't let 'em get into your kitchen. Gideon didn't say a word, but he gave the windage knob a slight click. In his mind, the world had dropped away. No blistering heat, no grit, just distance drop, and the man walking with a god complex through his own graveyard. Vane! Vance's voice boomed, echoing off the hollow walls. What are you protecting? A pile of scrap paper? A dying woman? Look around you. Ghost Junction is evolution in action. The strong decide who lives and who gets paved over for progress. Your grandfather learned that too late. Don't follow him into the dirt. Gideon gripped the stock. He remembered his grandfather's last letter. Regret is the final round. He felt the weight of it now. Regret wasn't a weakness. It was decades of built-up kinetic energy waiting for the right moment to go kinetic. One operative pushed forward, lugging a high-tech ballistic shield and a modern submachine gun. He swept his handheld radar toward the tower. Target spotted. Second floor, church. The grunt yelled. Crack! The M24 tore through the silence of Ghost Junction. The bullet didn't hunt the operative. It found a rusted gas canister Gideon had seated behind the man's position. The blast sent the soldier and the shield flying, kicking up a wall of chaotic smoke and debris. Spread out, lay down, suppressing fire, Vance barked, diving behind a headless monument in the center of the square. A hail of lead shredded the bell tower, stone chips flying like shrapnel. Gideon rolled, dodging the stream of fire by a hair's breadth. He crawled to a secondary firing slit, narrower but safer. Cassidy, can you give me 5 minutes? Gideon asked, eyes never leaving the glass. I've waited 38 years for these 5 minutes, Gideon. Get after it. Gideon pulled the recorder from his pack. He patched it into the church ancient PA system, which he'd activated back to life with some copper wire earlier. He hit play. Sterling Vance's voice from 1988 thundered through the ghost town. It was the command post recording clear, cold, and monstrous. Black Cell. This is Vance. Test subjects at Ghost Junction are in place. Deploy Manticore immediately. Disregard collateral. History remembers the win, not the bodies. The operatives froze, their boots stock dead. Even for the most cold-blooded mercs, the truth about slaughtering their own countrymen was a gut punch. Vance went ballistic, his face turning a humiliated shade of crimson. Kill that garbage, kill them both. He emptied his clip toward the tower, but Gideon was already gone. He'd rappelled down the back of the church, moving like a shadow through the ruined cloisters to flank the square from the right. Gideon crouched behind a stone pillar barely 30 yards from Vance. He could see the sweat on the man's brow, the slight tremor in the throat of a man about to be unmasked. Gideon chambered the final round, his grandfather's dark brass masterpiece. Suddenly, a dust devil swept across the square, turning the world into a blur of brown grit. Vance spun around, waving his gun wildly. Vane, show yourself. Fight me like a man, don't be a yellow belly like your grandfather. Gideon stepped out of the dust, M24 held at the hip. He didn't need the scope. At this range, the smith trusted the connection between hand, steel, and mark. My grandfather wasn't a coward, Gideon said, his voice steady against the howling wind. He left me the one thing he never had, the power to put this to bed. Vance pivoted, his nickel-plated muzzle leveled at Gideon's chest. He let out a crazed laugh. You're too slow, Vane. This vest is carbon composite. Your antique rounds are just toys. Vance squeezed the trigger. Click. His gun jammed. The Nevada grit had found its way into the over-engineered guts of his modern sidearm, locking it up at the moment of truth. It was a glitch of nature, or maybe the spirits of Ghost Junction holding back the hammer. Gideon didn't blink. He pulled the trigger. Silas Vane's bullet screamed through the sand. It wasn't a standard slug. It was a hardened steel core heavy, built to punch through the toughest hides. It caught Vance dead center, zipping through the million-dollar vest like it was wet tissue paper, before burying itself deep into the stone monument behind him. Vance buckled. His eyes bulged, staring down at the hole in his chest, then up at Gideon. No words came out, only a dark, cold crimson spill from his mouth. He hit the deck in the middle of the square where, 38 years prior, he'd ordered a massacre. Gideon ran back to the tower. Cassidy was still there, the tape reaching its end. She saw Gideon, saw the blood on his shirt and the silence in the square. "It's done, Gideon. Done, Cassidy." Justice finally found his mark. Gideon grabbed a satellite phone from a dead Mertz pack and synced the data. He hit send on every file, recording and photo, blasting them to the biggest papers in the country and the federal prosecutor's office. Under the desert sky, those bits of data took flight, dragging the truth out of the shadows. Cassidy smiled. She leaned her head on Gideon's shoulder, looking out at the ruined town. In the fading twilight, it seemed the ghosts of Ghost Junction were finally fading out, the weeping and the rage finally going quiet. "You hear that, Gideon?" she whispered, her voice as faint as the wind. The silence. "It's finally peaceful." Cassidy closed her eyes. Her final breath drifted away into the Nevada air. She'd finished the long walk. Gideon stood among the ruins for a long time. He broke down the M24 one last time and left the stock beside Cassidy's body, a tribute to the last hunter. 2 months later, in a small town in Montana, the sound of a hammer hit the anvil. But this time, Gideon Vane wasn't hiding in the dark. His forge was bright with light, and a new sign hung outside: Legacy Restoration and Pius Quarchin. And Pius Quarks. Gideon was shaping a massive block of steel. He wasn't casting guns anymore. He was taking the steel from confiscated weapons and melting them down into a massive bell. On its side, he'd engraved every name from the Ghost Junction manifest. Every time the Blackfoot Mountain wind blew, the bell would chime. It wasn't a gunshot, and it wasn't a cry. It was the echo of the truth, the most powerful weapon the Vane family had ever built.